The farm had turned its back on him, casting him out like a stranger with nothing more than the dust on his boots and the bitterness in his chest. Once, he had been the son-in-law trusted to carry the family's name into the future, but pride and whispered lies had poisoned their faith. Branded as unworthy, he left under a sky bruised with storm clouds, the weight of betrayal heavier than any saddle he had ever carried. In the Old West, exile was often a sentence harsher than death, for it stripped a man not only of land but of belonging. Seasons passed, and the farm endured without him, though not without scars. Crops withered in drought, barns leaned under the wind, and the family who had turned him away learned that gold and soil meant little when trust had rotted from within. Their nights grew long, their mornings bitter, and whispers of the son-in-law's departure haunted them like an unspoken curse. For though they had cast him aside, the shadow of his absence stretched across every acre. But the West has a way of bringing the forgotten back when least expected. At harvest, when the field should have sung with abundance, the land bore little but dust. The family gathered in silence, weary and hollow, their pride broken beneath the weight of failing soil. Then, through the haze of morning light, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. His figure was familiar yet changed, hardened by exile, steadied by resolve. The rejected son-in-law had returned, not with bitterness in his hands, but with something far greater. Cradled in his arms was the child the family had never known existed, their hidden heir, the blood of their own legacy, carried back into their lives by the very man they had cast away. Gasps spread through the farmhouse like wildfire, eyes wide, hearts thundering as the truth stepped across their threshold. Betrayal had forced him into the wilderness, but destiny had led him back with the seed of their future. The silence of that harvest morning was unlike any other. Pride clashed with shame, fear tangled with awe, and the West itself seemed to hold its breath. The son-in-law they had rejected stood before them, no longer broken, no longer begging for place or acceptance. He had returned with the one thing that bound them all together, the child whose existence would change the course of their family forever. And in that moment, the real harvest was not of the land, but of truth long buried, now revealed. The family's eyes locked on the child, their shock mingling with disbelief. The matriarch clutched the edge of the table as though the wood itself might keep her standing, her lips trembling with words she could not speak. The patriarch's jaw tightened, pride warring with the undeniable truth staring back at him in the child's eyes, the same eyes that mirrored his own bloodline. For years they had believed the son-in-law unworthy, a man without the strength or honor to carry their name. Yet here he stood, holding not only his own redemption, but the living proof of the family's future. The air in the farmhouse grew heavy, the silence broken only by the child's soft coo. Every gaze in the room shifted uneasily, as though the walls themselves bore witness to the weight of hidden secrets. Some saw betrayal, others saw salvation. But the rejected son-in-law said nothing of his exile, nor of the long nights he had endured alone. He placed the child gently on the matriarch's lap, his expression steady, his voice calm. "This is your heir," he said simply, and those words carried more power than any weapon. The patriarch's pride cracked under the weight of those words. His hands shook as he reached forward, not to reject, but to confirm what his heart already knew. The child bore the features of their lineage, undeniable and unshakable. Years of suspicion and harsh judgment collapsed in a single moment, leaving behind the bitter taste of shame. The old man's voice, once iron, faltered. Why was this kept from us?" The son-in-law's gaze hardened, though not with cruelty. "Because you had no faith in me," he answered. "Because you chose whispers and pride over trust. And when you cast me out, you cast out your own blood with me." His words stung deeper than any blade, carving truth into the hearts of those who had betrayed him. The weight of his exile was no longer his to bear alone. It belonged to them as well. In the corner, the eldest daughter, the one who had once stood silently as her husband was driven away, buried her face in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. She had been torn between loyalty to her family and love for her husband, and now the cost of her silence stood before her in flesh and blood. The West was a land unforgiving of weakness, and her silence had been her greatest sin. The harvest had brought no crops, but it had brought a reckoning far greater. The rejected son-in-law's return did not bring relief, but instead a storm that threatened to split the family apart. The brothers whispered a betrayal, their voices sharp with anger. They saw him not as a redeemer, but as a reminder of their father's mistake, a shadow cast over their inheritance. The arrival of the child meant their grip on the future was no longer certain, and greed, that familiar devil of the West, began to gnaw at their hearts. But the townsfolk, hearing of his return, spoke differently. Around fires and in the saloon, they whispered of the man cast out in shame who had returned with an heir. To them, it was more than family drama. It was legend in the making. For in the West, stories of downfall and redemption traveled faster than the wind, and already men were saying the harvest had delivered not crops, but a truth too powerful to ignore. The patriarch, torn between shame and pride, found himself caught in the storm of his own making. He had cast out the very man who now carried his bloodline forward. His son's jealous anger burned like dry brush, while his wife's tears watered the seed of guilt. The family, once bound by land and name, was unraveling under the weight of secrets revealed at the worst of times. The son-in-law, however, did not flinch under their glares. He had endured exile, hunger, and loneliness. He had nothing left to fear. Standing tall in the farmhouse, he looked each of them in the eye, daring them to deny the child's blood, daring them to cling to lies when the truth stood living and breathing before them. His silence was heavier than their anger, his presence more powerful than their accusations. That night, as lanterns burned low, the widow of the family's eldest son, who had died seasons before, spoke the words that no one else dared to say. "Maybe this child is not a curse," she whispered, her voice trembling but clear. "Maybe he is the only hope we have left." Her words cut through the tension like lightning across the prairie sky, leaving everyone staring at the child, not with disdain, but with the possibility of salvation. The rejected son-in-law had returned not only with blood, but with the key to their survival, and the harvest had only just begun. Morning light spilled across the fields, barren and cracked from seasons of failure. The patriarch walked among them with heavy steps, the weight of his choices pressing harder than the sun itself. Behind him, the rejected son-in-law stood quietly, the child in his arms. It was a strange picture. The man once banished now returning with the very seed of their lineage, standing shoulder to shoulder with the father who had judged him unworthy. The silence between them carried years of bitterness, yet also the faint trace of something neither dared to name: hope. The brothers, however, did not share that hope. They watched from a distance, their jaws tight, their eyes burning with jealousy. In the return of their sister's husband, they saw the thread of displacement. The land they had expected to inherit might now fall into the hands of the child he carried. Greed twisted their grief into anger, and by nightfall, their whispers had turned into plans. The West was no stranger to blood spilled over land, and envy was as dangerous as drought. The matriarch, clutching the child close, tried to soften the storm brewing in her household. She saw in the infant the reflection of her husband's youth, a fragile bond that could heal what pride had broken. Yet each time she held the heir, the brothers' resentment grew sharper, as though the baby itself had stolen their birthright. "This is our land," one of them growled in private. "We'll not let an outcast's blood take what belongs to us." The rejected son-in-law knew the danger. He had lived long enough on the edges of survival to recognize the look of men who believed violence could solve what honor could not. But he did not retreat. Instead, he stayed, determined that the child would not grow up knowing exile as he had. In his silence was a challenge. Let the truth stand, or let their hatred consume them. Either way, he would not walk away again. The patriarch, torn between his sons and the heir before him, found himself staring into the face of his own legacy. He had allowed pride to banish one son-in-law, and now greed threatened to destroy the rest of his family. The West was merciless to those divided from within, and he knew if he did not act soon, the farm would not only lose its land to drought, but its name to betrayal. The tension erupted during the harvest gathering, when the family traditionally came together to share what little the land provided. The townsfolk arrived, curious to see the spectacle whispered about in saloons, the return of the outcast, and the unveiling of the hidden heir. Lanterns glowed, casting long shadows, and the smell of roasted grain filled the air. But beneath the songs and forced laughter, everyone felt the crackling edge of conflict waiting to ignite. The eldest brother rose suddenly, his voice cutting through the chatter. He pointed at the child cradled in the matriarch's arms, his words dripping with venom. "This boy is no heir of ours. He is the blood of a man who was cast out in shame. Are we to forget why he was sent away? Are we to hand our future to a stranger who clawed his way back only to steal what is rightfully ours?" His accusations rippled through the crowd, the air thick with unease. The rejected son-in-law stood, his face calm, but his eyes sharp as steel. He did not raise his voice, but his words carried to every corner of the gathering. "I never came to steal. I came because this child belongs to you as much as he belongs to me. He is your blood, your legacy, your future. You cast me out, but in doing so, you cast out your own flesh. Now I return not for myself, but for him." His words landed like bullets, silencing the crowd. The patriarch's face burned with shame, torn between the voices of his sons and the truth he could no longer deny. He looked at the child, at the widow who had carried him back, and felt the crushing weight of years lost to pride. For the first time, his authority trembled, not because of drought or debt, but because he saw the fracture of his family laid bare in front of the entire town. The crowd watched, breathless, as the family's future balanced on the edge of a blade. In the West, land and blood were sacred, but so too was honor. And in that moment, everyone understood that this was no longer a quarrel of inheritance. It was a reckoning that would either restore the family's name or shatter it forever. The eldest brother's challenge hung heavy in the air, his words rattling the crowd like a rattlesnake's tail before the strike. The younger brothers nodded in agreement, their faces darkened by envy and fear. To them, the child was not hope. It was a thief waiting to strip them of everything they believed belonged to them. The widow holding the infant clutched him tighter, her hands trembling, while whispers swept across the gathering. Pride and greed had poisoned the harvest feast, and the scent of violence hung thick in the night. The rejected son-in-law stepped forward, the lantern light casting his shadow long against the barn wall. His voice was steady, but his tone carried the weight of storms endured in exile. "You speak of shame," he said, fixing his gaze on the eldest brother. "But the only shame here is the fear that blinds you. You call him a thief, yet he has taken nothing. He is only a child. It is not his innocence that threatens you, but your own unwillingness to face the truth." The words cut sharper than any blade, and the brothers shifted uneasily. The patriarch rose slowly, his cane striking the wooden floor with each step. The murmurs fell into silence as all eyes turned to him. His face was pale, lined with years of toil and regret, but his voice carried the authority of a man who had once ruled the family with iron will. "Enough," he commanded. "This land has already suffered under drought and loss. If we let jealousy poison us further, it will not be the soil that dies. It will be our name." Yet even as he spoke, doubt clung to his voice, for he knew his authority was slipping through his fingers. The eldest brother snarled, stepping closer to the rejected son-in-law. "You think you can walk back into this family, carrying a bastard child, and claim what's ours? You're no son of this house. You're nothing but dust." His hand drifted toward the knife at his belt, and gasps rippled through the crowd. The rejected son-in-law did not flinch. He had faced worse in the wilderness, and he knew the brother's fury was not strength, but desperation. Tension sparked like gunpowder waiting for flame. The widow holding the child wept silently, torn between fear for her baby and hope that the truth would prevail. The sheriff, who had come quietly to watch, placed his hand on his revolver, sensing that blood was only a heartbeat away. The crowd leaned forward, every soul aware that the fate of the family, and perhaps the town, was about to be decided under the harvest moon. The rejected son-in-law lifted his chin, his eyes locking on the brother's hand as it tightened around the knife. His voice, though calm, rolled through the silence like thunder. "Strike me if you will," he said, "but know this. Every cut you make will not fall on me, but on the legacy you claim to protect. This child is your blood. If you deny him, you deny yourself." His words trembled with restrained fire, carrying the kind of truth that could not be silenced. The brother's knife hovered, gleaming in the lantern light. His breathing grew heavy, his face twisted in fury, but his hand did not fall. Something in the son-in-law's gaze, unyielding, fearless, stopped him cold. For in that look, he saw not weakness, but a man forged in exile, a man who had nothing left to lose, but everything left to prove. The knife trembled, then lowered, his pride wounded, but his spirit unsettled. The patriarch's cane struck the ground again, the sound sharp as a gunshot. "This ends here," he said, his voice breaking with age and authority. "I cast him out once, blinded by pride. I will not make the same mistake again. This child is ours, born of our blood, and whether you accept it or not, he will inherit what is rightfully his." His words fell heavy, leaving no room for defiance. The crowd erupted into murmurs, some nodding in approval, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The brothers' faces burned with anger, their ambitions cut down by their father's decree. Yet none dared to move against him, not under the watchful eyes of the sheriff, not with the entire town standing witness. The truth had been spoken, and in the Old West, words declared under the harvest moon carried the weight of law. The rejected son-in-law bent his head, not in defeat, but in solemn respect. He had not needed violence to reclaim his place, only courage and truth. The child stirred in his arms, as if sensing the tide that had turned. And as the lanterns flickered against the dark, the farm that had once rejected him now stood at the edge of a new beginning, its future cradled in the small hands of an heir who had finally been recognized. The days that followed the patriarch's decree were heavy with tension. The farm, once alive with the rhythm of harvest, now carried the weight of unspoken grudges. The brothers worked the fields with clenched jaws and bitter silence, their anger simmering just beneath the surface. Every glance toward the child felt like a dagger, every word exchanged with the rejected son-in-law laced with venom. The truth had been spoken, but acceptance was far from one. The matriarch, however, held fast to the heir with a quiet devotion that softened the edges of the storm. She rocked him gently on the porch, humming old songs that once filled the farmhouse when her children were young. To her, the child was not a threat, but a blessing, a second chance to heal the fractures carved by pride and grief. Her love, simple and unwavering, became a small light in the shadows of resentment. The townsfolk watched closely, whispering of the family's fate. Some admired the son-in-law's courage, saying he had returned not as a beggar, but as a man carrying destiny in his arms. Others doubted his intentions, convinced he had brought the heir back only to seize power through the child. In saloons and around campfires, the debate raged. Was he a redeemer or usurper? The West had little patience for uncertainty, and rumors often carried sharper edges than knives. The sheriff kept his distance, but remained vigilant. He knew jealousy was a dangerous seed, and in families, it could grow into violence that lawmen were powerless to prevent. He had seen too many ranches destroyed not by drought or raids, but by brothers who turned their guns on each other. Watching the family unravel, he feared this tale might end the same way. The rejected son-in-law, aware of the danger, spent his nights awake by the hearth, the child cradled in his arms. He whispered promises into the darkness, vows that the boy would never know the pain of exile, that he would grow into a man unbroken by pride or greed. Each promise was not just for the child, but for himself, for in raising the heir, he would also redeem his own name. But redemption rarely comes without trials. One evening, as the sky bled red with the last light of day, the eldest brother approached the barn where the rejected son-in-law worked. His hands were calloused from labor, but his eyes gleamed with fury. "You think you've won," he hissed, stepping closer. "You brought that child here to take what belongs to us. But mark my words, blood may bind him to this family, yet it will not make him our master." The son-in-law straightened, his grip firm on the wooden beam he was repairing. He met the brother's glare with calm resolve. "I brought him here because he deserves to know where he belongs. If you cannot accept him, then it is not him you deny, it is yourself." The words struck like iron, but instead of softening the brother's heart, they hardened it further. His fists clenched, his rage boiling over in a silence more dangerous than words. That night, the brothers gathered in secret, their whispers sharp as knives. Pride wounded and inheritance threatened, they spoke of ending the matter once and for all. "The child is the root of it," one muttered. "Without him, the farm remains ours." Their faces, lit by the dim glow of lanterns, bore the marks of envy turned to desperation. And in the West, desperation often led to violence before reason could intervene. The matriarch sensed the storm brewing within her sons. She clutched the child closer, her prayers rising into the night like fragile smoke. She had seen death before, had buried children in the dry soil of the farm, but the thought of her family tearing itself apart over pride was a pain deeper than any grave. Her tears fell silently onto the child's hair as she begged the heavens for mercy. Meanwhile, the rejected son-in-law sharpened his resolve as he sharpened his tools, knowing that the greatest battle was not against the land or the drought, but against the greed festering inside the very home he had returned to. He understood the brother's hatred, for the West had taught him that men feared losing more than they feared dying. And he knew, sooner or later, they would force him to prove with more than words that he was worthy to stand where they had once cast him down. The storm broke on a moonless night, when the silence of the farm was shattered by the creak of floorboards and the soft rustle of boots. The rejected son-in-law awoke with a start, sensing danger the way only men hardened by exile could. The fire in the hearth had burned low, and in its dim glow he saw shadows moving near the doorway. His hand went instinctively to the rifle propped against the wall. He had known this moment would come. The brother's jealousy had festered too long to remain idle. The matriarch stirred, clutching the child to her chest, as the door swung open. The eldest brother entered first, knife in hand, his face twisted with desperation. Behind him, two more brothers followed, their eyes burning with the madness of envy. They had not come to speak. They had come to erase the future that threatened their claim. "Step aside," the eldest hissed. "This ends tonight. That boy will not steal what is ours." The rejected son-in-law rose slowly, his rifle in hand, his body shielding the matriarch and child. His voice, low but steady, filled the tense air. "This is not your land to lose. It never was. It belongs to the blood that runs through him, and no blade can cut that truth away." His words carried the weight of every hardship he had endured, every moment of exile turned into strength. The brothers hesitated, their knives trembling, caught between rage and the force of his conviction. The patriarch's cane struck the floorboards from the hallway, the sound sharp as a gunshot. He appeared, pale and trembling, but his voice carried the thunder of authority. "Enough," he roared. "This boy is my heir, and if you raise your hands against him, you raise them against me. If you spill his blood, you will curse this family until its name is ash." His words froze the room, cutting through the haze of violence. The brothers faltered, shame and fury warring in their eyes. For a moment, the weight of their father's command pressed heavier than their envy. Slowly, their knives lowered, their pride cracked but not broken. They turned and stormed into the night, their footsteps echoing across the porch like thunder, fading into the distance. The danger had passed, for now, but the farm remained steeped in tension, its peace fragile as glass. Morning came heavy, the light of dawn spilling across the farm like judgment. The family gathered in silence, each face etched with the scars of the night before. The patriarch sat at the head of the table, his hand trembling as he reached for the child cradled in the matriarch's arms. He lifted the boy gently, his voice hoarse but steady. "This is our future," he declared. "Not because of land, not because of gold, but because he carries our blood. And if we do not protect him, then we are no family at all." The rejected son-in-law stood nearby, his gaze fixed on the old man. For the first time since his exile, he saw in the patriarch's eyes not disdain, but respect, earned not by wealth or obedience, but by the strength to return with truth in his arms. Their past could not be undone, but in this moment, both men understood that legacy was built not on pride, but on sacrifice. The brothers lingered at the edges of the room, their faces shadowed with shame. They had been willing to spill blood for greed, but the weight of their father's words still hung over them like chains. Whether their envy would die or grow stronger remained uncertain, but one truth was clear: the heir could not be denied. The child's presence had changed the course of the family forever. The townsfolk, hearing of the confrontation, spoke of it with reverence. Around campfires and in dusty saloons, they repeated the tale of the man cast out who returned at harvest, carrying not vengeance, but the hidden heir that restored a broken family. Some said it was justice, others called it destiny. Either way, the story spread across the prairie like wind through tall grass, becoming part of the living legend of the West. And as the sun rose higher, the rejected son-in-law stepped outside, the rifle still slung across his shoulder, his eyes fixed on the horizon. He had come back to the place that had once turned him away, and though the wounds remained, so too did the chance for redemption. In his arms rested not just a child, but the promise of a future stronger than the past. In the West, where pride and greed so often devoured men, this harvest had yielded something greater than grain. It had yielded truth. The story of the rejected son-in-law had begun with exile and shame, but it ended with something far more powerful: redemption written in flesh and blood. What once seemed like a man cast out forever became the seed of renewal for a family torn apart by pride. His return, carrying the hidden heir in his arms, reminded them all that the West had a way of uncovering truths buried by arrogance, and that no secret, however deep, could stay hidden forever. The patriarch's decree sealed not only the child's place in their lineage, but also his own chance at redemption. His authority, long corrupted by stubborn pride, found new strength in humility. For a man of the West, nothing was harder than admitting he was wrong. Yet in choosing truth over tradition, he showed that honor is not measured by never falling, but by having the courage to rise when you do. His words carried weight because they were carved from regret, and the family would never forget them. The brothers' envy stood as a warning, a mirror of what greed can do when left unchecked. They had nearly destroyed their own blood in pursuit of land that would turn to dust without unity. Their knives and whispers failed because the truth was stronger, but their resentment served as a shadow, a reminder that in families, as in the West, the greatest battles are often fought not with guns, but with hearts poisoned by envy. The widow's tears and the son-in-law's resilience tied the story together. She had carried the heir through silence and shame, and he had carried him back to the place that once rejected them both. Their courage showed that sometimes love must stand alone against the weight of the world, and that survival is not about clinging to what is lost, but about protecting what is yet to come. Their journey turned pain into promise, carving a legacy that no drought or jealousy could erase. This tale lingers because it is more than a story of bloodlines. It is a story of truth, courage, and the power of second chances. It challenges us to ask, how often do we let pride blind us to the blessings right before us? If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. What lesson spoke to your heart the most? And don't forget to like this video and subscribe, so together we can keep bringing to life the untold stories of the Old West. Stories that remind us that even in the harshest lands, redemption can always take root.